So, what actually makes a government decision reasonable? It's a huge question, right? It can feel super complex. But what if I told you we could figure it all out by planning a road trip from Johannesburg to Cape Town? This question really gets to the heart of a big democratic idea. How do we hold power accountable? But you're going to see that the answer isn't just a simple yes or no. It's more like a whole spectrum of possibilities, kind of like all the different routes you could take on a really long drive. And to really get our heads around this, we're going to borrow this brilliant analogy from the legal expert Ian Curry. Seriously, this simple idea of a road trip is going to make this entire concept click. Okay, so picture this. An administrator has to make a decision. Let's imagine that decision is the route they choose to drive from Joburg to Cape Town. Now, the court's job, well, it isn't to get behind the wheel and drive. Its job is to look at the map and just ask one thing. Does this route make any sense? And right here, we hit on an absolutely crucial legal distinction, the difference between an appeal and a review. See, an appeal asks, was this the correct decision? A review, on the other hand, asks, was this a reasonable one? So a court can't just step in and say, hey, the route through Bloemfontein is way better. Nope. All it can do is ask, is the route you chose a legally defensible way to get to Cape Town? They can't just swap in their own preference. All right, so let's check out the very first test any decision has to pass. This is like the absolute bare minimum standard for a route to even be on the table. Okay, so imagine the administrator comes up with this route. They want to go from Johannesburg to Gaborone in Botswana, then all the way over to Windhoek in Namibia, and then down to Cape Town. I mean, come on, you don't need a PhD in geography to see that this makes absolutely no sense. It's totally disconnected from the goal of getting to Cape Town in an efficient way. In legal speak, this is the test for rationality. The decision, our road trip route, has to have a logical, common-sense link to its purpose, getting to Cape Town. The info they had, the reasons they give, and the final decision, it all has to connect in a way that makes objective sense to a normal person. And this isn't just some abstract legal theory. It's written right into South Africa's Promotion of Administrative Justice Act, or as everyone calls it, PAJA. It basically gives a court a checklist to ask, is there a rational link between this decision and its purpose, between the decision and the law that gave the administrator the power in the first place? If the answers are no, then the decision fails the rationality test. Simple as that. The court in the famous Carafone case nailed this down perfectly, even before PAJA existed. They established this fundamental need for a logical, objective link between all the evidence you start with and the conclusion you end up with. This really sets the baseline for everything else. Okay, so a decision has to be logical. That scenic detour through Namibia is definitely out. But what happens when a decision is perfectly logical, but it still just feels wrong or unfair? Well, that brings us to a much deeper test, proportionality. So let's think about a new route, straight down the N1, right through Bloemfontein. It's logical, it's direct, it passes that rationality test with flying colors. But here's the thing, just because a route is rational, that doesn't automatically make it reasonable. And this idea is captured perfectly by this famous legal saying, you shouldn't use a sledgehammer to crack a nut. This gets right to the heart of proportionality. The action you take has to be in proportion to the goal you're trying to achieve. Just because something works doesn't mean it's the right way to do it. So proportionality usually gets broken down into three key questions. First, is the decision suitable? Like, will it actually get the job done? Second, is it necessary? In other words, was there a less drastic, less harmful way to do the same thing? And finally, you have to ask about balance. Does the good this decision achieves outweigh the harm it might cause? This whole idea of balance was front and center in the massive Bato starfishing case. Here, the government had to allocate fishing quotas. Now, the decision was rational, for sure, but it had these huge, life-altering consequences for people whose livelihoods depended on fishing. The court had to step in and decide if it was proportional. And Justice O'Regan, writing for the Constitutional Court, laid down a test that was so simple but so powerful. She said the standard is reasonableness itself. A decision is unreasonable if it's the kind of decision that a reasonable person in that same position with the same information could simply not have reached. And what's so great is that the court didn't just give us a definition. It gave us a practical toolkit, a set of factors to look at. To figure out if a decision is reasonable, you have to look at the whole picture. Who made the call? What's their expertise? What different interests are clashing here? And maybe most important of all, what is the real-world impact on people's lives?
So let's zoom out for a second. We've got these two big ideas, rationality and proportionality. So how do they actually fit together? Well, it's time to look at the full map. See, reasonableness isn't like an on-off switch. It's a spectrum. On the one end, the low scrutiny end, you've got basic rationality. The court is just asking, is this logical? But on the other, high scrutiny end, you have full-blown proportionality, where the court is asking, was this balanced? Was it necessary? Was it suitable?
Think of it like a sliding scale. Depending on those factors from the Botto Star case, like how much a decision impacts fundamental rights, a court will slide the intensity of its review up or down. A really technical decision made by a world-class expert, that might get less scrutiny. A decision that could devastate a community, that's going to get a much, much closer look. And this brings us to what is maybe the most crucial takeaway from this whole journey. An irrational decision is always unreasonable. No question. Driving through Namibia to get to Cape Town is out. But, and this is the key, a rational decision can still be unreasonable if it fails the proportionality test. That direct route through Bloemfontein is perfectly logical, but if it causes massive harm that another route could have avoided, it might still be found unreasonable. So that begs the question, why don't courts just demand the best or most proportional decision every single time? Well, the answer comes down to this idea called judicial deference. Courts have to respect that it's the administrator's job to make the call, not theirs. They're often the appointed experts, and respecting that role is a fundamental part of the separation of powers. At the end of the day, it's all just a really delicate balancing act. The whole goal is to keep government power in check and make sure decisions are fair, without having judges overstep their bounds and start acting like administrators themselves. And that leaves us with the ultimate challenge, doesn't it? A court can't strike down a decision just because they think it's a bad one. It has to be legally unreasonable. And figuring out where to draw that line, the line between a policy choice you might just disagree with and a decision that is legally indefensible, that is the constant, tricky task at the very heart of administrative law.